in special partnership with and brought to you by our friends at FLYN. On today's show, where we explore personal, social, and work transformation, we have Heather Cabot. Heather is an author, award-winning journalist, podcaster, keynote speaker, and former ABC News correspondent and anchor. She's the host of the New Chardonnay podcast and the author of the New Chardonnay, The Unlikely Story of How Marijuana Went Mainstream. It was published in August 2020. The book has earned praise for deep reporting and entertaining storytelling. It was selected by Good Morning America as a must-read. Heather's also the co-author of the Wall Street Journal acclaimed Geek Girl Rising, inside the sisterhood of shaking up tech. She's spoken widely about entrepreneurialism, startup financing, diversity at tech events hosted by Google, Facebook, Audible, Accenture, WeWork, Vimeo, and more, as well as appearances at South by Southwest. The list goes on. Today, we explore her book's character study and the story of legalization of marijuana in the US and Canada and lessons learned. So without further ado, let's get into the show. Well, Heather, welcome to the show. Just briefly, an introduction, for yourself. You're an author, an award-winning journalist, podcaster, keynote speaker, former ABC correspondent, and anchor. You're the co-author of the Wall Street Journal acclaimed Geek Girl Rising. That was your first book inside the sisterhood of shaking up tech. Just in August, you released your new book, The New Chardonnay. It's the unlikely story of how marijuana went mainstream, which it's received widespread praise, so congratulations.
Thank you.
The book dives into this world of legal cannabis, like stories of Snoop Dogg, his business partner, rolling out their new cannabis brand, California wine country, where chefs are ushering a new age of elevated cannabis dining, adventures with a marijuana mogul who fends off shady characters, and rural Canada, like my hometown, where you tell the story of the Willy Wonka of weed. So there's a lot here. I think that we're going to have, a lot of fun with the conversation. And, thanks so much for being on the show.
Thanks so much for having me. Thanks for your interest.
Yeah. Hey, Heather, to begin, I'd like it if actually you tell the story of your trip to the Marijuana Business Conference in Las Vegas while you were researching the book and how that all came about. Because I think it's a great place to start because in a way it speaks to your origin story for the book.
Yeah, absolutely. So I had never even heard of the Marijuana Business Convention. I was not part of the marijuana subculture at all. As I say in the book, I'm a person who grew up in the just say no generation. I'm a suburban mom of teens. But as you mentioned, my first book, Geek Girl Rising, that book dealt with women advocating for change in Silicon Valley. And one of the chapters in that book was about women investing in other women, female angel investors, venture capitalists who were backing women-led tech startups. And around the time that book was first coming out, I noticed that some of the women who I'd interviewed for the book and who I knew personally, that they were starting to invest in cannabis startups. And I thought it was really nuts. I didn't understand why. I didn't know how big the industry had become. I didn't know how professional it had become. I really didn't know anything about it. And I just couldn't understand why these people that I regarded as, very respectable and upstanding, and, they all had Wall Street credentials, and I just didn't understand why they would invest in something still federally illegal. It seemed very risky to me. And I just didn't get it. So I started making phone calls. And one of the women who I spoke with, turns out was a very early tech investor. She was an early investor in cannabis. Her name's Jean Sullivan. And she said to me, listen, I can't explain this to you in a phone call. You need to actually go and see for yourself. Get a ticket to the Marijuana Business Convention, go and walk the floor, go to the expo, meet the investors, meet the entrepreneurs, go to the seminars, go to the keynote speeches, and you'll be able to get a much better sense of how big this really is. And so that's what I did. And I went and spent a week in Vegas. I went to the crash course on weed. And, I remember showing up there thinking that I was going to be walking into some smoke-filled conventions. I mean, I really didn't know what to expect. I thought it was going to be people in tie-dye, you know, people stoned out of their minds. And turns out I walk into the Las Vegas Convention Center and it's like any other trade show that I've ever been to, with lots of mostly white men, you know, handing out business cards and wearing their lanyards with their name tags and carrying swag bags and, you know, taking notes on laptops and legal pads. And it just was this moment where it was the complete opposite of what I expected. And during that process of just being there, I realized that I probably was not alone in not understanding that this had really come out of the shadows. And so that sort of began this odyssey of figuring out what the story was and finding these really interesting characters. It was definitely the people that drew me to the story, for sure.
Yeah, like, I mean, kind of getting, right into the story, the title of your book, The New Chardonnay, it's an interesting one. Can you explain a little bit more about the title, The New Chardonnay? Like, what does that mean to you?
Well, the new Chardonnay refers to a number of different themes in the book, but overall, it was this idea of, what is more mainstream than Chardonnay, right? It was the most popular wine at one point in the US. It was the wine that everybody asked for at happy hour in the 80s. And I just thought, wouldn't it be interesting if cannabis ever became, if it ever reached that sort of point where it was, the stigma had fallen away so much that, you would maybe go to a Christmas party, and instead of bringing wine to the party, Chardonnay to the party, you might bring edibles, or you might bring, some pre-rolls, or some type of cannabis product. And actually early on in the research, when I had spent time in Canada, I was in Toronto for the, now I'm going to remember I'm not going to remember the name of the event. It was it was sort of like the Clio Awards of cannabis. And I went with Ted Chung, Snoop Dogg's business partner. And I was there with him. And we had interviewed one of the early, he was working on a documentary for Mary Jane, which is their media company. And he'd let me tag along to some of the interviews. And anyway, we were interviewing one of these early investors in cannabis, and he actually said that he felt that in Canada, and at the time, this was the fall of 2017, so it was a year before recreational adult use went national in Canada. And he said, I really think, a year from now, this is what people are going to bring when they go to someone's house. They're not going to bring a bottle of wine, or maybe they'll bring a bottle of wine, but then they'll also bring a cannabis product. And I just thought that's interesting. And so just from that moment, and as I continued to have conversations, this idea of Chardonnay, and in particular appealing to the Chardonnay moms, which most people might think of as sort of the soccer moms, suburban moms like me, that became a really interesting theme. And as I talked with people across the book, they referred to it in different ways, and they all had sort of different aha moments. So for Ted and Snoop, very early on in my reporting, they told me, and Ted told me, that the Chardonnay moms that they believed that the Chardonnay moms would be the modern marijuana consumer, that there would be other groups, but they really felt like that was the group that, as they looked at the opportunity, they felt like that was going to be the fastest growing group. These people who previously, maybe they tried it in college, but they really were not regular consumers. And this was an opportunity to reintroduce weed to this very different population with money to spend. And so that was from that first conversation. The other part of it was, back to Canada, there's the whole storyline around Bruce Linton and Canopy Growth and his focus on innovating around beverages, and this idea that maybe at some point in the future that these THC infused beverages might one day give alcohol a run for its money. And I thought that was really interesting. And then the final part was the fact, and I did not know this until I started researching it, but in Colorado, when voters passed Proposition 64, which later became Amendment 64, it was actually written as the act to regulate marijuana like alcohol. And what I researched and what I talk about in the book is how that was how they convinced voters. The activists who were trying to legalize adult use in Colorado, they made a very strong argument that voters obviously in the end agreed with, that cannabis in some ways was safer than alcohol. And that was their big message. So I also thought that was interesting. I felt like throughout the book, there were these themes where what was happening with cannabis kept intersecting with the alcohol industry. And so, as I said earlier, what's more mainstream than Chardonnay? It just felt like a fitting title for the book to kind of raise that question. I'm not saying that cannabis is the new Chardonnay yet. I think we have a long way to go, but I felt like it was a provocative title to get people thinking about it, and to also reference the fact that some of these early entrepreneurs, that is what their goal was to mainstream it in that way.
Yeah, it's like creating that bridge from now to the new Chardonnay, and just kind of being able to make all the different connections is interesting. I think that's something that you like to do in your writing. Like in your previous like co-authored book, Geek Girl Rising, you introduced readers to like fearless female founders, technologists, innovators, like all fighting at a grassroots level for ownership in the tech revolution. And in your new book, the new Chardonnay, each of your characters are cannabis trailblazers, like in their own way. You seem to have a deep curiosity for people who break traditional barriers. Like, what is it about people breaking new ground that gets you so fired up?
Well, I'm just curious. I'm a curious person in general. I'm always, I mean, I think just my background as a reporter, I always want to know people's motivations, and I want to understand the psychology behind why people take risks, how they create something new. Like, I just think that's so fascinating, this idea of like, why does someone take the leap? Like, it's many people have great ideas, but very few people really take it to that next level and actually go for it and do it. And I myself sometimes can be a little bit risk averse. So I really admire that in other people. But I also love this idea of the fact that the world is always changing. And I'm fascinated by that change. And I never want to be left behind. And I'm just curious about how things are constantly evolving and changing, and making sure that I'm keeping up with that just personally. And so that, I think that just naturally kind of filters into my work. And then this deep admiration that I have for people who are risk takers. And particularly in this context of cannabis, where there really was so much at stake for these people who decided to go for it in such at such an early time, whether it was the major financial risks they took, the reputational risks they took, and then even in some cases risking their freedom because it's federally legal in the US. There are various points in the book, and I think about Beth Stabolo's story where she got involved with some with some unsavory characters where she potentially could have risked her freedom. And there are points in the book where we talk about her bank accounts getting shut down, or she gets stopped at the border, or so it's risk at like an almost an even different level than being in tech, that just really drew me to the story. And the idea of why what would possess someone to want to take those risks. So
Yeah.
I'm always interested in that, and I find it inspiring.
Well, I would challenge you to say that you're risk averse, because like you definitely went out of your comfort zone and you dove into this new space, right? And there's several different like social, economic, political forces that have brought marijuana into the mainstream, like racial injustice, self-care, alternative to opioids. Like there's new business and investment opportunities. Like if you take racial injustice, for example, like each year, the US has hundreds of thousands of arrests made for marijuana possession. Like Black, white Americans, are, have marijuana use at similar rates, but Black people are 4 times as likely to be arrested. This type of statistic is staggering, but
Yeah.
it's just like one example of so many different issues that are wrapped up into the topic of marijuana legalization.
Yeah.
What I wanted to ask you was, what were some of the key learnings you found from doing this cannabis research in following your character stories?
Well, you hit on definitely one of the biggest ones, which is that because I was not, am not a cannabis consumer, and really, had no dealings with the industry, or the criminal justice system, I didn't understand until I really started looking more closely at this, the relationship between systemic racism and drug enforcement policy. And I was shocked by it and saddened by it. And it continued to kind of haunt me throughout the research that I did. The statistic that you mentioned from the ACLU, what's amazing about that statistic, that Black people are 4 times as likely than white people to get arrested in the US, even though for cannabis possession, even though the usage is the same. That number has not really changed since the first report on that came out in 2012. The ACLU just released another report this spring that showed that it's still the same, even in the face of other states, now more states legalizing. Even in Colorado, where it's interesting, the arrest rate, and I talk about this in the book, the overall arrest rate went down in the state, but for people of color, it did not. So these are really deep-seated issues that need to be addressed. I think, in terms of what's happening, I mean, I was just, before I came on to talk with you, I was listening to one of the press conferences happening in Louisville right now in the wake of what's happening with the Breonna Taylor case there. And as we've seen all summer here in the US, this outpouring and unrest that's happening around this racial injustice that is so ingrained in society here. And I think cannabis is one example, drug enforcement is one example of how, how these policies have been racialized for decades and decades, and why there is perhaps a moral imperative, and not even perhaps, there is a moral imperative in my mind to change the system here. And it's important that people are talking about that now. I don't think that until this year, certainly with the presidential election, you did not hear candidates talking about it in that context. You heard activists talking about racial justice, but you didn't necessarily, I mean, we saw in the Democratic primary debate here at Senator Cory Booker, talking about it in prime time, and about how the war on drugs has been a war on people of color, and why federal drug reform on marijuana, would make a difference in the lives of people who've been disproportionately targeted. So I think it's important that those conversations are happening. We have a lot of work to do, but the fact that it's out in the open is really important. So for me personally, that was not anything that I really knew much about. And I thought that was definitely a big takeaway for me. And it's one of the things I've tried to talk about as I've been doing these interviews, and to try to educate people about it.
Yeah, and I might be veering a little bit away from the book, but
Yeah.
why do you think society has stayed in the dark for so long when it comes to the issue of cannabis legalization? And,
Well,
and I guess why is the public so willing to accept a war on drugs?
Well, I don't think the public is now. I mean, I think if you look at the polling in the US right now, it's the highest it's ever been for acceptance of legalization. And I think, that shift has happened quite quickly. There are a variety of factors for that, which I talk about in the book. One is obviously, as I said, this conversation we're having around the racial injustice of drug enforcement, and how it relates to mass incarceration. But in addition, I think, prior to 2013, there was not a real mainstream understanding of the concept of medical cannabis, or even the potential therapeutic benefits. Now, I know in Canada, we had medical cannabis long before us. You were ahead of us in terms of your medical program. In the US, it was still piecemeal state by state. And so I think it really wasn't until 2013, and I talk about this in the book, this documentary that CNN did, where Dr. Sanjay Gupta apologized and got on the air and basically said that he was sorry for not acknowledging the potential therapeutic benefits of cannabis. And that was a huge moment for a lot of people, because it was the first time that a mainstream news outlet shed light on the Charlotte Figi story, which was the young girl with a seizure disorder who passed away this past year, but who was helped by CBD. For many people, that was a watershed moment because it legitimized what activists had been talking about for so long. So I think that was a big moment. And then unfortunately, you have a lot of lobbies in the US. I mean, in many ways, it comes down to money. It's the private prison industry, and I talk about that in the book. I mean, there are a lot of stakeholders that want to see this prohibition continue because they make money off of it. I mean, that's a very sad thing. But that's a real thing. I think, we always say in journalism, follow the money. I think that's the case. So I do think from a public opinion point of view, I do think we're at a tipping point, certainly in the US. I think people recognize medical benefit. I think they recognize the jobs and the economic impact. I think they recognize that these racial injustices need to be corrected. And now it's just a question of, when. I think what you're going to continue to see, given the gridlock that's happening in Washington and the mess that's going on there in general, and the fact that we're just Congress can't even pass a stimulus package to get people aid right now who are really suffering or unemployed. I think at this point, it's up to the states. And in terms of people that I talk to, that is where the momentum is going to continue here in the US, is it's going to continue to be this patchwork of state by state, eventually, whether it's passing medical programs or eventually taking medical and expanding to adult use. That's where you're going to continue to see the momentum here, at least in the near term.
Yeah, thanks for that. What I loved about your book was the in-depth reporting. It was very well researched. But what I even like more than that was how you combined the research with entertaining storytelling. I felt there was almost like a fiction behind your characters because they had such interesting lives. You had Snoop Dogg on Martha Stewart cooking and telling people how the secondhand marijuana just improved Martha's stage performance. And these are just funny stories. So the question is what was your process finding these ideal characters for your book?
Well, there were just so many to choose from. I mean, that was actually the biggest problem there. Like I said earlier, who would take these risks? They're all really interesting people. And they all have reasons for doing it, personal reasons. And so for me, it was a combination of, talking to as many people as possible and then trying to figure out, who was willing to give me the access, who was allowing me to actually spend time with them so I could really get a window into their world, and meet their families and, see them at home or be with them in the office and to really be able to observe. I think that's really important for this type of storytelling. So it definitely was access. And I really wanted to choose characters that anybody could relate to, even if they didn't care about cannabis at all. I wanted to choose people that I felt had sort of overarching, sort of universal stories, whether it's Beth Stavola, who's, the hard-charging former Wall Street exec who becomes a stay-at-home mom and is really not happy and is looking for this opportunity to go back to work, and yet balancing that with what her husband wants and her kids. And I just felt like people could relate to that. Or the story of Chef Jeff, Jeff Danzer, who has this really amazing coming out story where he goes from being this Orthodox Jewish man living this very kind of traditional life in the suburbs with his wife and 3 sons, and September 11th happens and he decides that, he's had this secret his whole life that he's really gay, and he lives through that tragedy and comes, and comes to this moment where he says, I'm not living my truth. I want my kids to know who I really am. And he ends up coming out to them and starting this whole new life as a single gay man. And then through cannabis and his love for cooking, finds himself on this other journey to become the Julia Child of weed. And I love this, I'm always really interested in second acts. I'm always interested in also people who start out doing one thing and then end up doing something else and why they do that. So I just wanted to choose people who had compelling stories in general. And it took a lot of just getting to know them and spending time with them and talking to lots of people who know them well, whether it's family or colleagues. Um, it was, you know, an amazing process and a difficult process because, like I said, there are a lot of people that could have been the four main characters, but at the end, I sort of had to be disciplined to say, okay, you know, these are the four who I have the most material on and who have, you know, allowed me to spend the most time with them. And then I had to figure out how their stories might intersect. And I did not know that their stories would intersect. I really had no idea. And it took 3 years of being with them to see and literally diagramming it. I'm writing it out and making timelines for each person and then figuring out where the intersections might be. So it was a long exercise.
No, it again, like I just loved how these people came to life in a really unique way. Like each character definitely had an interesting character arc, like whether you had the female Wall Street executive foraging into like a mostly male dominated marijuana industry, or a gay man coming out to his family and then following his passion to become a cannabis chef, or Snoop, you know, in his cannabis brand and being a champion and becoming a champion for social justice. Like a lot of cool things going on. Like what were like with the characters, what were some of the most important realizations you think your characters experienced during these adventures?
Well, I mean, definitely, you know, Bruce Linton, you know, he's such an amazing character. And, you know, for your audience, he's the co-founder of Tweed and the founder of Canopy Growth and former CEO of Canopy Growth, which is still known as the largest legal cannabis company in the world. And you know, for Bruce, I think one of the most simple learnings, you know, it's something that anyone could learn from, which is the idea that it's okay to make mistakes. That when you're innovating, you have to be open to making mistakes. And when you make them, it's not fun, it's hard, it's uncomfortable. You know, in his case, he's, you know, answering to investors and shareholders and, you know, but he had this vision of what he wanted to do. And he surrounded himself with people also who had expertise. And I think as the company grew, you know, he wasn't afraid to take those risks and know that he might stumble. And with each stumble that I write about in the book, there were learnings from those that made him more successful along the way. And I think that's an important lesson for anyone. I think oftentimes we're afraid to fail. We're afraid to put an idea out there because it just sounds so crazy. And, you know, what happens if we fall on our face, you know, but he does that. I mean, he did that in the early days. But the fact that he could do it and acknowledge it and learn from it and not get discouraged and walk away, I think that's a lesson for anyone. It's the same thing with Beth, you know, Beth Stavola, who gets involved with this criminal, you know, almost loses her $1 million investment. You know, she has so many missteps. And she was very candid to share them with me. And I think, you know, by the end of the book, you realize that she kind of had to make those mistakes in order to be as successful as she is. And one of the biggest learnings for her, which I wanted the audience to understand is, and the same thing for Bruce, is, you know, to me, the thing that I found so fascinating about this industry is the fact that it has been underground for so long. And so the challenge for people who are coming in, who are trying to legitimize it, is how do you take something that's lived in the shadows, existed only in the shadows for so long, and all the people who are the experts at running those illegal businesses, how do you tap into that and flip it and make it legal and make it legitimate and upstanding? And how do you know who from the old world you can trust in the new world? I mean, essentially these people were criminals. Now, they're not criminals now, but some of them are. Some of them are incarcerated and not allowed to be part of the industry, which is a whole other social justice aspect of this too. But I just found that so interesting. Like, how do you kind of know who to trust? And then what do you have to do to build businesses that the public can trust? You know, and so for Beth, like that was a big learning for her. How do you sort of make it so that as I talk about, look, she was ruthless about following the letter of the law. She had to be, just like the drug cartels were ruthless in another way, in another context, when they were operating, as criminal operations and running from the law. Now she has to be ruthless about her people following the law, and she has to bring in the most respectable, upstanding people to run her business so that she can be taken seriously, so she won't lose her license, so that she can keep customers. And so I thought that, to me, that was so, I thought it was really, really interesting. And there were a lot of learnings in that for her. So back to your question, there were a lot of takeaways from that in trying to figure that out and find the right people and make the right decisions, all of that set the stage for her success. If she hadn't gone through all of that, she would never have been as successful as she was.
Mm-hmm. Like, this kind of segues, questioning outdated models of how business and politics and societies run. I think it's one of the core messages of your book, like that questioning process, right? What do you think organizational leaders can learn from the outside when they look on this new and innovative cannabis industry? I think you talked about it like in your last answer, quite a bit, but I think there's things that even a traditional business can take from this.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that, I think that questioning the way things have always been done, is a really important, it's something that, to be a really strong leader of an organization, I think you have to always be questioning, well, why are we doing things this way? And why have things always been done this way? And is there a way we can do it differently? And how do we bring in more voices? And how do we honor the fact that maybe we don't have all the answers, but we need to bring in diverse points of view to get in, that who will in the end create things we've never seen before, right? To not centralize all of that power among maybe the same people who've always held those roles, but to expand that out. And obviously I write about diversity in the industry in the book, and the lack of diversity in the cannabis industry, and why that happened, and why there is a need for industry, as legalization happens, to create space and to create opportunities for people with diverse backgrounds to have a stake in the industry. So I think that's probably the overarching theme in the book, is kind of questioning the narrative, and always sort of wondering if we can do things better or different, and why are things done this way, and what's the reasoning behind that, and kind of looking underneath that. I think is really central to actually all four of the characters in the book.
Mm-hmm.
I always talk about this being this, for my own journey, sort of being an Alice in Wonderland moment of everything that I thought was true was actually the opposite. And I think you have to go into situations, when you're leading in an organization, always kind of questioning your own perception of things, and recognizing we all have our own biases and our own experiences, and how those kind of color the way we see different situations or different structures, and reminding ourselves it's important to question those. I think that's, I don't know if that answers your question.
No, yeah, definitely. Heather, like, this has been like such a fun conversation. To end it, I was going to ask you, if you have a message for transformative leaders, after your experience writing this book, what would it be?
Well, I think one of the things that I really loved about all of these different characters in the book is they really trusted their instincts. And whether that instinct was to question, whether that instinct was to follow their passion because they believed that something could be a life-changing opportunity, both for maybe their families and maybe for society. I think it's really important for us more than ever to be tuned in to our instincts. And oftentimes we allow our society's expectations of ourselves, or how we see leaders portrayed in the media, or I think sometimes we we prevent ourselves from being our authentic selves, and prevent ourselves from really listening to that little voice inside. That's whether it's that voice telling you to be curious about something, or maybe to double check something that maybe doesn't feel 100% right, or to listen more to our instincts. I think that's really important. I think all four of these characters really do that, and then they're not, and they do it in a way that people think they're crazy, but they keep going. And I think there's something to learn from that, which is that you got to believe in your ideas. And that's not to say don't listen to other people, and make sure that you're getting lots of, all these characters surrounded themselves with very, with people with lots of expertise, whether it's Chef Jeff researching the cannabis scientific trials going on in Israel, or Beth bringing in the former Reagan appointed prosecutor to help her, or they all are they don't have, I mean, they have egos, but they allow themselves to recognize like where their shortcomings are, and they bring in expertise, but at the same time they have this, they're compelled to keep moving forward. And that's, to me, that's very genuine and very brave. Very few people listen to that. So I think as to be a transformative leader, I think you need to be able to give yourself credit and validate your own instincts on things, and see them through. And it may not work out. You may fail. It may not be the best idea, but to see that through and take that risk, I think is something that everybody can take away from the characters in the new Chardonnay.
Again, Heather, I just want to congratulate you on your book. It's a wonderful read. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you for your support. Please remember to click subscribe so we can bring you more remarkable interviews with extraordinary leaders.